the year 1215. A crimson suffocating glow hangs over the smoking ruins of Zhongdu, the capital of the mighty Jurchen Jin Empire. The air, thick, heavy, impossible to breathe, is saturated with an acrid mixture of smells. The char from thousands of burned buildings, the sweetish decay of decomposing bodies, the sharp metallic scent of fresh blood, and the wild animal stench of thousands of Mongol horses. The city, which only recently was one of the greatest metropolises of the world, a center of luxury, learning, and power, is now a silent, charred graveyard of its ambitions. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of corpses litter the wide avenues and narrow alleys, their sprawled bodies creating a gruesome, surreal pattern on the cobblestones. The fire, having nothing left to devour, now only lazily licks the blackened skeletons of carved pagodas that once reached for the sky, and turns to ash the libraries that held in scrolls of silk and bamboo the thousand-year wisdom of the Celestial Empire. Somewhere in the very heart of this man-made hell, amidst a deafening silence broken only by the crackle of smoldering beams, the shouts of victors dividing their spoils and the distant fading moans of the dying, stands a simple nomadic tent. It stands out crudely against the ruins of a great civilization, steeped in the smell of horse sweat, sour milk, and rendered sheep fat. Inside this tent, on rough felt carpets, a boy is born. His name is Kublai. He is the fourth son of Tolui, the youngest and most beloved of the sons of the man whose name already instills an irrational primal terror from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea. His grandfather's name is Genghis Khan, the perfect warrior, the scourge of God, the shaker of the universe. No one at that moment, in that hour of bloody triumph, could have imagined that this very infant, whose first cry mingled with the death rattles of a dying city, was destined not just to continue the cruel work of his grandfather, but to radically transform it, to turn it inside out. He was fated to travel an unimaginable path from an obscure prince of a nomadic horde, one among many, to the Son of Heaven, the Lord of the most ancient, populous, and refined civilization on the planet. He was fated to be torn his whole life between two abysses: the legacy of his fierce steppe ancestors, for whom the world was but a pasture for their horses, and the temptations of a great sedentary culture that promised eternity and order. He would become a living bridge between two incompatible worlds, but this bridge would be built of tempered steel and uncongealed blood, of the most delicate palace intrigues and the greatest of deeds. The story of Kublai is not just a chronicle of conquests and battles. It is a grand saga of a clash of civilizations, of the painful birth of a new syncretic empire on the smoking rubble of old worlds. It is the story of a man whose personality was as complex, multifaceted, and contradictory as the era in which he was destined to live and rule. It is a tale of how the grandson of history's greatest destroyer became one of the greatest creators, and of the exorbitant price that he, his people, and the entire world had to pay for this greatness. And this story begins in the dense, all-consuming shadow of his omnipotent grandfather, the man who, by the force of his will, forever changed the face of Eurasia. To grasp the scale of Kublai's personality, one must first immerse oneself in the world that created him, a world reshaped according to the designs of a single man, Genghis Khan. Before him, the land we call Mongolia was a seething, bloody cauldron. Dozens of warring tribes and clans, the powerful Tatars, the cunning Karits, the vengeful Merkits, waged an endless war of all against all. For centuries, they stole each other's livestock and wives, made alliances sealed with blood and broke them with ease, lived by the primal laws of blood feud and unceasing raids. It was a land of extremes, of scorching summer heat and bone-chilling winter cold. A harsh land that bred harsh, taciturn people, where a man's life was valued less than a good horse, and the only visible border was the endless horizon, merging with the eternal blue sky, their chief deity, Tengri. Temujin, born in humiliation, who in childhood knew betrayal, the loss of his father, and the shame of slavery, managed to achieve what seemed impossible. Like a mighty blacksmith possessing an inhuman will, the genius of a strategist, and the talent of an unsurpassed organizer, he seized this disparate, anarchic mass of tribes burning with mutual hatred and reforged it into a single people, a monolithic nation of steel welded by iron discipline and a common, intoxicating goal: the conquest of the entire world. He gave them the great Yasa, a code of laws that was more sacred and important than any tribal customs. The Yasa was simple and ruthless. It punished with death for betrayal, cowardice in battle, adultery, and theft on a large scale. But at the same time, it established principles that were centuries ahead of their time. The Yasa proclaimed absolute religious tolerance, exempting from all taxes and duties the clergy of all religions: Buddhist monks, Christian priests, Muslim mullahs, Taoist hermits. Genghis Khan understood. Faith is an instrument of governance, and it is better to have loyal priests praying for you to their gods than to have pockets of hidden resistance. He created an army that had no equal in the world at that time. It was not a chaotic horde. It was a perfectly tuned, soulless war machine. At its core was a simple and brilliant decimal system. Warriors were organized into tens or arbans, hundreds or yaghuns, thousands or minguns, and tumans of 10,000 warriors. This structure ensured impeccable manageability and interchangeability. Every warrior was a horse archer from birth. From early childhood, a Mongol boy learned to sit in the saddle as naturally as to walk, and to shoot a bow as habitually as to breathe. Their main weapon was the complex composite bow, glued together from several layers of wood, horn, and sinew. It was a deadly weapon capable of sending heavy arrows 300 to 400 meters and piercing chainmail and even plate armor at close range. Their hardy, short-legged Mongolian horses could survive for days on whatever forage they could find. Covering vast distances, the tactics of the Mongols were the pinnacle of the military art of the era. They avoided frontal assaults, preferring to wear down the enemy with endless volleys of arrows. Their signature move was the feigned retreat. A wave of cavalry would simulate a panicked flight, luring the enemy's heavy cavalry into a trap, where they would be surrounded and annihilated by fresh forces from the flanks. They were unsurpassed masters of siegecraft, driving tens of thousands of prisoners before the walls of cities as a human shield and using the most advanced Chinese and Persian siege technologies. And they were masters of psychological warfare. Rumors of their total cruelty, of cities slaughtered to the last infant, of pyramids of severed heads, flew beamed ahead of their armies, paralyzing the will to resist. Cities that surrendered without a fight were spared. Those who dared to resist doomed themselves to complete annihilation, serving as a terrible lesson to all others. By the time of Kublai's birth, this machine had already ground up several great civilizations. The rich Tangut kingdom of Xixia had fallen. The Jin Empire in northern China had been brought to its knees. The powerful and prosperous Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, from Samarkand and Bukhara to Urgench, had been wiped off the face of the earth. The advanced detachments of the Mongols, led by the brilliant commanders Jebei and Subutai, had swept like a fiery whirlwind through the Caucasus, defeated the combined forces of the Cumans and Russian princes at the Battle of the Kalka River, and returned to the steppes, reporting to the Khan about the existence of new lands for conquest. The empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It was a predatory state army whose economy was fed by war booty and tribute from conquered peoples, and whose aristocracy, the Noyans and Bagaturs, could not imagine their existence outside of war. Such was the world in which Kublai grew up, a world where the highest valor was to kill an enemy, and the highest value was loyalty to one's clan and Khan, a world that he and his brothers were destined to inherit, while the unstoppable Tumans were expanding the empire's borders in its heart. In the nomadic encampments on the banks of the Onan and Kurlan rivers, a new second generation of Genghisids was growing up. Among them, a special privileged position was held by the sons of Tolui, the fourth and favorite son of Genghis Khan by his chief wife Böke. Tolui was a true son of his father, a fearless warrior, adored by soldiers for his generosity and personal courage, but he did not inherit 1/100th of Genghis Khan's political genius. After the death of the Shaker of the Universe in 1227, according to the Mongol custom of Ochigan, that is, guardian of the hearth, it was Tolui, as the youngest son, who inherited his father's yurt, the core Mongol lands. He was regent of the empire for 2 years, until the Kurultai of 1229, at which, according to Genghis Khan's will, his older brother, the more placid and pleasure-loving Ögedei, was elected Great Khan. Tolui's fate was short and tragic. In 1232, during a campaign against the Jin Empire, he died at the age of about 40. The official, almost hagiographic version of his death stated that the great Khan Ögedei had fallen seriously ill, and the shamans declared that the evil spirits of the land and water of China were taking revenge for the devastation and demanded a member of the imperial family as a sacrifice. Then the valiant Tolui, without hesitation, performed a ritual. He uttered an incantation, taking his brother's illness upon himself, drank a cup of charmed water, in essence poison, and died, thereby saving the Khan. However, in the corridors of power, there were other whispers. Tolui was too popular in the army, too influential, and possibly posed a threat to Ögedei's power. His sudden death was too convenient for the ruling house. Tolui's death made his 4 sons by his chief wife, Möngke, Kublai, Hulagu, and Ariq Böke, orphans. But they were given the greatest gift of fate in the person of their mother. Sorghaghtani Beki, Tolui's wife, was not just a noblewoman. A niece of the powerful Kerit ruler Togrul, whom Genghis Khan had overthrown, she was, without exaggeration, one of the most intelligent, far-sighted, and politically gifted women of her era. Being a Nestorian Christian, she possessed a breadth of vision inaccessible to most Mongol aristocrats. She intuitively understood what others did not. That brute military force alone could not forever rule the world. The Persian historian and vizier Rashid al-Din, who served the descendants of her son Hulagu, wrote of her with unconcealed admiration. She was extremely intelligent and capable and stood like a tower above all the women in the world. And if I wished to list all her praiseworthy qualities, it would take a long time. It was Sorghaghtani, this brilliant woman politician, who laid the solid foundation for the future greatness of her house. While other Mongol princes carelessly spent their youth in endless circular hunts, drunken feasts, and military games, she insisted that her children receive a well-rounded education. She saw that the future of the empire was being decided not only in the steppes, but also in the chancelleries of conquered countries, in the administration of millions of sedentary subjects with their complex economy, culture, and 1,000-year-old traditions of bureaucracy. She carefully distributed the roles. Möngke, the eldest, was raised as an ideal Mongol ruler, stern, just, and loyal to the traditions and laws of the Yasa. Hulagu, who was destined to conquer the Muslim world with fire and sword, studied military affairs and Persian customs in depth. Ariq Böke, the youngest, remained with his mother in the core lands, preparing for the traditional role of guardian of the paternal yurt. Kublai, however, was destined for a special fate. Already in his youth, he began to show an uncharacteristic, almost unhealthy, from the point of view of Orthodox Mongols, interest in Chinese civilization. Most of his kinsmen looked upon the Chinese with contempt, effete farmers, cunning city dwellers, cowardly officials fit only to pay tribute without question and bow to their conquerors. But Kublai, guided by his mother, saw something else. He saw the wisdom of millennia embodied in philosophical treatises. He saw a perfect system of governance, capable of digesting and assimilating any, even the wildest conqueror. At Sorghaghtani's insistence, he surrounded himself with a whole staff of Chinese advisors, Confucian scholars, former Jin officials, and Buddhist monks. His main mentor was the sage Yao Shu. Under their guidance, Kublai studied the Chinese language, calligraphy, the history of dynasties, and the fundamentals of Confucian ethics with its cult of order, humane governance, and strict hierarchy. In 1236, during the reign of Khan Ögedei, when conquered lands in northern China were being distributed as appanages to Mongol princes, the 21-year-old Kublai was given a region with a population of 10,000 households in modern-day Hebei. This was his first independent experience, and here he behaved completely differently from his kinsmen. Other princes viewed their appanages as a source of immediate profit, imposing predatory taxes on the population, demanding tribute not only in grain and silk but also in young women and artisans. Kublai, however, following Yao Shu's advice, acted as a prudent master. He established an administration of Chinese officials, streamlined the tax system, reduced levies, began to invest in restoring irrigation systems, and patronized agriculture and crafts. He quickly realized a simple truth: a well-tended garden bears fruit for many years, while a scorched desert yields nothing. His small appanage quickly turned into an island of prosperity and order, attracting refugees from neighboring areas groaning under the unbearable oppression of other Mongol rulers. This appanage became an invaluable political laboratory for Kublai. It was here that he honed his skills as a ruler and formed his unique vision for the future of the empire, a vision that differed sharply from the traditional steppe conceptions of his grandfather and brothers. He already began to understand the fundamental truth that one of his advisors would later formulate. One can conquer the celestial empire from horseback, but one cannot rule it from horseback. The empire of Genghis Khan, which had seemed an indestructible monolith, began to be undermined from within by the rust of power struggles after his departure. The death of Ögedei in 1241, from the consequences of excessive drinking, plunged the empire into chaos. A 5-year period of regency by his widow, Sorghaghtani Beki, a domineering and ambitious but short-sighted and vindictive woman, ensued, contrary to the will of her late husband, who wished to see his grandson Shiramun as his successor. Sorghaghtani used all means, intrigues, and bribery to promote her own son, Güyük, to the throne. This led to a deep split in the ruling elite. The descendants of Ögedei and Çağatay, the second son of Genghis Khan, supported Güyük, but the powerful clans of the descendants of Jochi, that is, the Golden Horde, and Tolui, led by the wise Sorghaghtani, took a wait-and-see attitude, sabotaging the convocation of a Kurultai. Only in 1246 did Sorghaghtani manage to assemble a Kurultai and push through the election of Güyük as Great Khan. His short reign was marked by a sharp increase in tension between his house, the house of Ögedei, and the house of Tolui. Güyük hated Sorghaghtani and her sons, seeing them as his main rivals. The situation was inexorably moving towards open war, which could have split the empire. But in 1248, Güyük, leading his army west supposedly for medical treatment but in reality to strike at his main opponent, the Khan of the Golden Horde, Dadu, suddenly died near Samarkand. His death once again opened the way to the supreme throne, And here Sorghaghtani Beki, the great strategist, played her decisive game. She acted quickly and resolutely. Concluding a secret alliance with the powerful Batu Khan, who also did not want to see anyone from the hostile house of Ögedei on the throne, she combined the colossal resources of the two most powerful Uluses. With joint efforts, they convened a Kurultai in 1251. Despite the fierce resistance of the Ögedeids and Chagatais, who called this Kurultai illegal, an overwhelming majority elected Sorghaghtani's eldest son Möngke as Great Khan. This was a resounding triumph for the House of Tolui. Power in the Mongol Empire had irrevocably passed from the descendants of Ögedei to the descendants of Tolui. Möngke Khan proved to be a strong, tough, and effective ruler. He immediately carried out a bloody purge, executing dozens of his opponents, including Güyük's widow and many princes from hostile clans. He restored strict discipline in the application of the great Yasa, and he resumed the policy of conquest, which had been suspended during the years of internecine strife. He set two grandiose tasks for his brothers. Hulagu, the second eldest, was sent on a grand campaign to the Middle East, which a few years later would end with the capture of Baghdad, the execution of the last caliph, and the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate. And Kublai, who had already established himself as a talented administrator of Chinese lands, was entrusted with an equally difficult task: war in the south, the final conquest of all of China. For Kublai, this was his finest hour. He got the opportunity to apply his talents on an unprecedented scale. However, his first target was not the mighty and rich southern Song Empire, but the inaccessible mountain kingdom of Dali, located in the territory of the modern Chinese province of Yunnan. This campaign was a brilliant strategic move. It allowed him to bypass the main defensive lines of the southern Xiangyang from the southwest, creating a second unexpected front. The campaign of 1253 to 1254 demonstrated not only Kublai's command talent but also his political maturity. Unlike the standard Mongol tactic of total terror, he acted much more subtly and intelligently. Before storming the capital, he sent ambassadors 3 times with an offer of peaceful surrender. When the ambassadors were treacherously executed, he took the city by a furious assault, but strictly ordered his soldiers not to carry out a massacre and to spare the civilian population. Moreover, he kept the ruling dynasty of Dali and Payor as his vassals, which instantly secured him the loyalty of the local elite. This was a completely new, revolutionary approach to conquest. During Möngke's reign, Kublai's star rose ever higher. He was appointed governor of all conquered Chinese territories. In northern China, he founded his summer residence and new capital, the city of Kaiping, which would later become known to Europeans as the legendary Xanadu from Samuel Coleridge's poem. He continued his policy, surrounding himself with Chinese advisors, building schools, patronizing Buddhism and Taoism, and restoring the economy. But his rapid rise and his obvious Sinicization caused increasing irritation and suspicion among the conservative Mongol aristocracy at the Great Khan's court in Karakoram. In their eyes, he was an apostate, a traitor who had abandoned the sacred precepts of Genghis Khan, trading the free life of the steppe for effete Chinese luxury and treacherous palace intrigues. In 1257, their slanders achieved their goal. Möngke, yielding to the pressure of his entourage, removed Kublai from all his posts and sent his auditors to his domains to conduct a total inspection and uncover embezzlement. This was a most severe blow and a public humiliation. Any other prince might have rebelled, but Kublai, displaying miracles of humility and political foresight, sent his wives and children to the Khan's court as hostages, and then he himself personally appeared before his elder brother. He did not make excuses but humbly repented of all possible sins. This tactic worked. Möngke's anger turned to mercy, and he restored all of Kublai's powers. The crisis had passed, but mutual distrust remained. And soon events occurred that would blow the empire apart from within. In 1258, Möngke Khan, dissatisfied with the slow progress of the war against the southern Song, decided to personally lead the army. He led his troops into the difficult mountainous province of Sichuan to besiege one of the key fortresses. And here, in the hot and humid climate, in August of 1259, the great Khan, the lord of the largest empire in human history, died. The exact cause of his death is still unknown. According to one version, he fell to the arrow of a Song crossbowman. According to another, more probable version, he died of dysentery or cholera, which was devastating his army. His death was the stone that triggered an all-crushing avalanche. News of the Khan's death, carried by messengers of the Yamen postal service, flew to all corners of the empire. All military campaigns were immediately halted. The race for the vacant throne began. At this critical moment, their younger brother, Ariq Böke, the guardian of the core lands and leader of the conservative party, was in Mongolia, in the sacred capital of Karakorum. And Kublai, commander of the main Mongol army, was far to the south, in the very heart of enemy China. The empire stood on the brink of its first great civil war. The fateful news of Möngke's death reached Kublai during the siege of the city of Wuchang on the Yangtze River. He was faced with the most difficult choice of his life. According to inviolable tradition and the laws of the Yasa, all princes of the blood were to immediately cease all military actions and return to Mongolia to participate in the Great Kurultai, which would elect the new Great Khan. But Kublai, possessing a sharp political intuition, understood that this was a deadly trap. His younger brother, Ariq Böke, was already in the capital, Karakorum. He was the legitimate guardian of Genghis Khan's great yurt and enjoyed the support of the vast majority of influential Noyans from the old core Mongol clans. If Kublai, abandoning his loyal army, had gone alone to Karakorum, his fate would have been sealed, at best prison, at worst a quick and quiet death. Ariq Böke was the banner and hope of the conservative steppe party. He and his supporters genuinely despised Kublai. In their eyes, he was a renegade, an apostate who had traded the valor of a warrior for the wiles of a Chinese bureaucrat. They saw how he surrounded himself with Confucian sages, how he built cities instead of migrating, how he introduced taxes instead of taking tribute. For them, Kublai's rise would mean the end of the very traditional nomadic empire created by Genghis Khan, and the shift of the center of power and wealth from the sacred Mongol homeland to a foreign, effete, and hostile China. They could not allow this. Kublai, after agonizing deliberation and consultation with his Chinese and Mongol advisors, made the only possible, though extremely risky, move. He demonstratively violated tradition. Instead of going north to Mongolia, he concluded a favorable truce with the Song Empire and led his huge, battle-hardened army to his own headquarters, the city of Kaiping, also known as Zhongdu. And here, on Chinese soil, surrounded by his loyal troops and devoted officials, in May of 1260, he convened his own, separate Kurultai. This Kurultai, consisting mainly of his commanders and those Mongol Noyans, whose appanages and interests were linked to China, predictably and unanimously proclaimed Kublai as the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. At almost the same time in Karakorum, another Kurultai convened, a more representative, more numerous, and, from the perspective of traditional law, undoubtedly more legitimate one. It, as expected, elected Ariq Böke as Great Khan. For the first time in history, the Mongol Empire had two Great Khans, two centers of power, two irreconcilable visions for the future. Civil war became inevitable. This was not just a war between two brothers for power. It was a war of two ideologies, two civilizational paths. Ariq Böke represented the past, a unified nomadic empire ruled from the heart of the steppes, living by the laws of the Yasa and at the expense of exploiting conquered sedentary peoples. Kublai represented the future, a new syncretic empire, where a Mongol military elite would merge with a Chinese administrative system, where the center of power and wealth would shift from poor pastures to densely populated and economically developed regions. On Ariq Böke's side were tradition, legitimacy, and the support of most Genghisids, including the ruler of the Golden Horde, Böke, and the rulers of the Chagatai Khanate. On Kublai's side were a huge, experienced army and the virtually inexhaustible material and human resources of northern China. The war lasted for 4 long, bloody years, from 1260 to 1264. Kublai, possessing the resources of China, acted methodically and cruelly. His main weapon was not cavalry, but the economy. He established a total blockade of Mongolia, cutting off all caravan routes that supplied the steppe with vital goods, grain, tea, textiles, iron, and craft products. The steppe, unable to feed and provide for itself, began to slowly die of starvation and deprivation. Food prices in Karakorum skyrocketed. A famine began. Ariq Böke's armies, composed of excellent warriors, melted away not so much from battles as from hunger, disease, and mass desertion. Kublai, on the other hand, relying on his Chinese base, could easily maintain and equip huge forces. His troops, under the command of his loyal generals, defeated Ariq Böke's supporters in Manchuria and on the approaches to China. The decisive battles unfolded on the territory of Mongolia itself. Kublai's armies twice, in 1261 and 1263, captured and ravaged the sacred capital of Karakorum, dealing an irreparable blow to Ariq Böke's prestige and authority. In the end, resources decided the outcome of the war. In August 1264, completely exhausted by the struggle, abandoned by most of his allies, and seeing the unbearable suffering of his people, Ariq Böke decided to surrender. He personally arrived in Zhongdu and appeared before his elder brother. Kublai gave him a public, humiliating interrogation in the presence of all the noyand, asking, "Which of us was right in this dispute?" "We were right then, and you are today," Ariq Böke replied with unbroken pride. Kublai spared his life, but placed him in confinement. 2 years later, Ariq Böke died in prison under very mysterious circumstances, which gave rise to rumors of secret poisoning. Kublai mercilessly executed his main supporters and advisors. The victory was absolute. Kublai became the sole ruler, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. But this victory was a Pyrrhic one. The civil war dealt a mortal, incurable blow to the unity of Genghis Khan's empire. The rulers of the western Uluses, the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate, who had supported Ariq Böke, never truly recognized Kublai's authority. They became de facto independent rulers, only formally mentioning his name. The unified Mongol Empire, a colossus stretching from Hungary to Korea, de facto disintegrated into 4 independent states. The Ilkhanate in Persia, ruled by his brother Hulagu and his descendants, remained an ally but also pursued an independent policy. Kublai had won the throne, but in the process of the struggle, he had lost the empire. And now, standing on its ruins, he had to build a new one, his own. Having won the fratricidal war, Kublai definitively burned the bridges that connected him to the past. He no longer harbored any illusions. To rule his part of the fractured empire from distant, cold, and ravaged Karakorum was pointless and impossible. The center of his power, his financial and human resources, his ambitions, and his future, all were inextricably linked with China. In 1267, he made a fateful decision. He moved his main capital from Xiangyang to the site of the former Jurchen capital of Zhongdu, the very city that had been razed to the ground by his grandfather's army in the year of his birth. On these ruins, on this blood-soaked ground, he began the construction of a new city of unprecedented scale, which was to become the capital not just of China but of the entire world. He named it Dadu, the Great Capital. To the Chinese it was known as Kanbalik, the city of the Qian. Today we know it by the name Beijing. Dadu became the tangible embodiment of Kublai's imperial ambitions. It was not a spontaneously grown city. It was planned with mathematical precision and imperial scope according to the canons set forth in ancient Chinese treatises. Straight as an arrow streets, intersecting at strict right angles, created a perfect rectangular grid. At the very heart of the city, enclosed by its own purple wall, rose the Forbidden City, a grandiose palace complex with hundreds of pavilions, gardens, artificial lakes, and hills. Here, out of reach of ordinary mortals, lived the Khan Emperor himself and his court. The entire city was surrounded by a most powerful defensive wall over 15 meters high and with a perimeter of almost 30 kilometers, with 11 massive gates and watchtowers. A complex system of canals connected to the Grand Canal allowed merchant ships to approach the very walls of the city, ensuring an uninterrupted supply of food and goods. This was not a Mongol military camp, but a true imperial capital, designed to amaze the imagination, inspire awe, and demonstrate to the whole world the power and stability of the new authority. It was here in Dadu, amidst the scaffolding of his new capital, in 1271, that Kublai took an unprecedented, revolutionary political and ideological step. He officially proclaimed the founding of a new imperial dynasty in the Chinese style. He gave it the name Yuan, the origin, or the beginning. This name, taken from the most ancient Chinese philosophical text, the I Ching, known as the Book of Changes, carried the deepest sacred meaning and was intended to symbolize the beginning of a new cosmic era. By this act, Kublai definitively positioned himself. He was no longer just a Mongol Khan ruling China as an occupied territory. He was becoming a legitimate Chinese emperor, the son of heaven, who had received the mandate of heaven from the previous fallen dynasties. This was a brilliant move aimed at legitimizing his power in the eyes of millions of Chinese subjects and, most importantly, at winning over the Confucian scholar elite, without whom it was impossible to govern China. He was putting on the clothes of Chinese civilization in order to rule it, but on the path to complete dominion, one huge obstacle remained. In the south, beyond the Yangtze River, the southern Song Empire still existed, huge, incredibly rich, with a population exceeding 60 million people. It controlled the most fertile, anglicipulated, and economically developed regions of China, the homeland of rice, silk, and tea. As long as the Song was not conquered, Kublai's power over China remained incomplete, and his title of emperor conditional. The war, interrupted by Möngke's death and the subsequent civil strife, was to resume with a new decisive force. The key episode of this final war was the siege of the twin cities of Xiangyang and Fancheng on the Han River. These two most powerful fortresses, located on opposite banks of the river, were the strategic gateways to the Yangtze Valley, to the very heart of the southern Song. The siege began in 1268 and lasted for almost 5 years, becoming one of the longest and most stubborn sieges in world history. The Song garrisons, excellently supplied by the river, fought with desperate courage. The Mongol cavalry, the terror of the open plains, was powerless against high walls, deep moats, and wide rivers. Kublai realized that traditional Mongol methods would not work here. and so he resorted to the help of advanced technology. By his personal order, the best siege engineers of the time, the Muslims Ismail and Ala al-Din, were brought from Persia, from the allied Ilkhanate ruled by his brother Hulagu. They brought with them plans and knowledge for building giant counterweight trebuchets, siege engines never before seen in East Asia. These machines, which the Chinese in terror called Hui Hui Pao, that is, Muslim catapults, were true monsters of engineering thought. They could hurl dressed stone projectiles weighing over 100 kilograms for several hundred meters, crushing any walls. In early 1273, these death machines began their work. One of the very first projectiles, describing a huge arc in the sky, crashed with a deafening roar onto one of Fancheng's towers, causing colossal destruction and indescribable panic. Soon the city fell. The defenders of Xiangyang, demoralized, seeing the power of the new weapon and understanding the complete hopelessness of further resistance, surrendered to the victor's mercy. The way south was open. After the fall of Xiangyang, the huge Yuan army, under the command of the outstanding Mongol general Bayan, like an unstoppable flood breaking through a dam, poured into the Yangtze Valley. The Song army, demoralized, poorly managed, and torn by internal intrigues, suffered one crushing defeat after another. In 1276, Bayan's troops, without much difficulty, approached the magnificent Song capital of Lin'an, the city known today as Hangzhou, one of the largest and richest cities in the world at that time. The Dowager Empress, ruling on behalf of the child emperor, realizing the absolute impossibility of resistance, surrendered the city without a fight to save its magnificent palaces and million-strong population from massacre and destruction. The child emperor Gongzong was taken prisoner and sent with honor to Kublai's court in Dadu. It seemed the war was over, but the most loyal and irreconcilable Song patriots fled south on ships, along with the two surviving child princes, brothers of the captive emperor. They continued a desperate resistance at sea and in the coastal areas of Guangdong and Fujian. The final tragic act of this long drama was played out in March 1279 in the Canton Bay, in the grandiose naval battle of Yamen. A huge Yuan fleet under the command of the Chinese admiral Zhang Hongfan, who had defected to the Mongols, blockaded and attacked the Song fleet, which numbered over 1,000 ships. On these ships was the last bastion of the dynasty. The 8-year-old boy emperor, his court, officials, and tens of thousands of soldiers and refugees. The battle was fierce and bloody. When defeat became obvious, one of the most loyal Song dignitaries, Prime Minister Lu Shufu, to prevent the shame of capture for the last son of heaven, took the young emperor in his arms, tied him to himself, and together they threw themselves into the cold waters of the bay. Following him, in an act of mass suicide, thousands of other officials, court ladies, and soldiers took their own lives. The great Song dynasty, which had ruled southern China for a century and a half, ceased to exist. For the first time in over 300 years, all of China, from the Great Wall in the north to the tropical jungles in the south, was united under the rule of a single ruler. But this ruler was not a Han Chinese, but a Mongol, a nomad, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Kublai had completed the work that none of his predecessors had managed. He had become the absolute lord of the Celestial Empire. Having become the sole master of a unified China, Kublai faced a task perhaps more complex and grandiose than the conquest itself, the need to effectively govern this colossus with feet of clay. He could not rule China's 80 million strong population as his ancestral Mongol Ulus. He needed a complex, multi-level system that would, on the one hand, guarantee the eternity and stability of Mongol rule, and on the other, use 1,000 years of Chinese experience to manage a complex society and economy. The result was a unique administrative hybrid unparalleled in history, in which Mongol military traditions, Chinese bureaucratic sophistication, and even Persian and Central Asian financial practices were intertwined. The foundation upon which Kublai built the social structure of his new Yuan Empire was a rigid, legally enshrined ethnic and class division of the entire society. The entire population was forcibly divided into 4 unequal categories. The first category, the Mongols, the absolute elite, the new upper class possessing absolute privileges. Only they could hold the highest military and administrative posts in the state. They were practically exempt from taxes, bore no labor obligations, and were subject to judgment only under their own Mongol laws. Even for killing a Chinese person, a Mongol would only pay a fine. The second category, the Semu-Ren, meaning people with colored eyes. This was a motley, multinational category that included all non-Mongol allies and people from the western parts of the Mongol Empire: Uyghurs, Persians, Arabs, Turks, Syrians, and even Europeans. Russians, Alans, ancestors of the Ossetians, and Italians. Kublai actively recruited them for service because, on the one hand, he did not fully trust the Chinese elite, and on the other, he understood that illiterate Mongols alone were catastrophically insufficient to manage China's complex financial and administrative system. The Semu held key positions in the financial department, tax offices, foreign trade, and science. The famous Venetian Marco Polo, if he indeed served the Khan, belonged to this privileged category. The third category, the Han Rens, or Han people. This category included not only ethnic Chinese who inhabited the former Jin Empire in the north, but also other peoples conquered by the Mongols before the Southern Song, Kitayans, Jurchens, and Koreans. They were considered second-class citizens, their rights significantly limited compared to the Mongols and Semu. And finally, the fourth category, the Wisun Nan Ran, meaning Southerners. The lowest, most numerous, numbering over 60 million people, and most rightless category. These were the former subjects of the just conquered Southern Song Empire. Kublai trusted them the least and saw them as the main potential threat. They were forbidden to hold any significant state posts. Humiliating laws were introduced for them. A ban on carrying any weapons, a ban on holding assemblies, a ban on walking the city at night, and even on studying the Mongolian language. This caste system was a cynical but effective instrument of control. It was designed to prevent the assimilation of the small number of Mongols into the vast Chinese Sea and to forever secure their dominant position. However, it also planted a time bomb under the foundation of the Yuan Empire, creating deep, hidden hatred and racial animosity from the vast majority of the indigenous population. In the economic sphere, Kublai proved to be a bold and large-scale reformer, whose actions were centuries ahead of their time. He understood perfectly well that the power of his empire rested not only on spears and arrows, but also on a prosperous economy. He carried out a veritable financial revolution, making paper money, or banknotes, called chayo, the sole and mandatory legal tender throughout the vast territory of his empire. Previous Chinese dynasties had also experimented with paper money, but it always had limited circulation and was, in essence, just certificates backed by reserves of silver, gold, or silk. The yuan's Uchao Cheio became the world's first true fiat currency. Its value was guaranteed not by precious metals, but solely by the power and authority of an imperial decree. This system, centralized and controlled by the state, allowed for the creation of a single economic space and drastically cheapened and accelerated trade operations. But it also carried the mortal danger of uncontrolled emission and inflation, which became one of the main reasons for the collapse of the Yuan Dynasty under his less wise successors. Furthermore, Kublai carried out one of the greatest engineering projects of the Middle Ages. He initiated and completed the reconstruction and extension of the Grand Canal of China, directly connecting his new northern capital, Dadu, with the rich and fertile Yangtze River Valley. This new section of the canal, over 1,300 kilometers long, became the country's main economic artery. Along it, a continuous stream of barges loaded with rice, grain, and other goods flowed north to the capital and the troops. Kublai's reign became a golden age and the peak of the era known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. The vast space from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean, controlled by different branches of the Genghisids, became relatively safe for travel. The Great Silk Road, the ancient artery connecting civilizations, experienced its last great flourishing. Caravans protected by Mongol detachments carried silk and porcelain to the west and received silver, carpets, and new ideas from the west. Kublai also actively encouraged maritime trade. His huge junks sailed to India, the Persian Gulf, and even to the shores of East Africa. Merchants from all over the world arrived in the port cities of Quanzhou and Guangzhou. In the cultural and religious sphere, Kublai, true to the precepts of his grandfather, adhered to a policy of pragmatic religious tolerance. He understood that imposing a single faith on his patchwork empire inhabited by dozens of peoples was impossible and foolish. Islam flourished among the Simu merchants and in the western regions. Nestorian Christianity, the faith of his mother Sorghaghtani, was held in special esteem. But Kublai gave his main patronage to Buddhism, especially its Tibetan esoteric form. His personal spiritual mentor, guru, and friend was a young but incredibly gifted Tibetan Lama named Drogon Chogyal Phagpa from the Sakya school. Kublai appointed him state preceptor, or Goshi, effectively the head of all Buddhists in the empire. He even commissioned Phagpa to create a new, so-called square script, which was intended to become a unified script for all languages of the empire: Mongolian, Chinese, and Tibetan. Although this ambitious project ultimately failed and the script did not take hold, it vividly demonstrates Kublai's desire to create a new, imperial, syncretic culture. It was during this amazing era, in this bustling cosmopolitan cauldron of peoples and cultures, that a young and enterprising Venetian merchant named Marco Polo arrived in China. Together with his father and uncle, he, according to his own words, spent almost 17 years at Kublai's court, carrying out various diplomatic and administrative assignments for the Khan, and traveling throughout his vast empire. His book of the marvels of the world, written down after his return to Europe, became a true revelation for medieval Europeans, a window into an unknown, fabulously rich and highly developed world. Although many modern historians doubt the authenticity of some details of his account and his high status at court, his book as a whole provides an invaluable, vivid portrait of the Yuan Empire at the peak of its power. He described with admiration the splendor of Dadu, the wisdom and majesty of Kublai himself, the widespread use of paper money and coal as fuel, and the perfectly functioning postal system, all things that seemed like real miracles to the inhabitants of a fragmented and poor Europe. Kublai's court was truly the center of the world, where at one table could sit a Mongol warrior, a Chinese Confucian scholar, a Persian astronomer, a Tibetan lama, and an Italian merchant. Having reached the pinnacle of his power, uniting all of China under his hand and creating a prosperous, stable empire, Kublai, it seems, fell victim to what the ancient Greeks called hubris, a pride and overconfidence that inevitably leads to a fall. A series of dizzying successes created in him a dangerous illusion of his own omnipotence and divine election. It seemed to him that there was no force left in the world capable of resisting his will, his armies, and his fleet. This fatal delusion pushed him into a series of extremely ambitious and, as it turned out, absolutely catastrophic military adventures that undermined the power of his empire. The first and main target of his insatiable ambitions was Japan. This country, securely separated from the mainland by the sea, had never been part of the traditional Chinese sphere of influence and lived its own separate life. However, its refusal to recognize Kublai as its supreme suzerain and pay tribute was perceived by him not as a reasonable political choice, but as a daring personal insult. He sent embassies to Japan several times with an arrogant demand for immediate submission. The Japanese military government, the so-called shogunate, located in Kamakura, invariably responded with a proud and contemptuous refusal, and the last embassy in 1280 was publicly executed, which became an unheard-of insult to the lord of the Yuan. Kublai's patience snapped. In 1274, he equipped and sent a first punitive expedition to the shores of Japan. The fleet, consisting of nearly 900 Korean and Chinese ships, carried an army of about 40,000 warriors, Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans. The armada landed in Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu Island. Initially, the tactical advantage was on the side of the invaders. Their powerful crossbows, firing a shower of bolts and primitive gunpowder bombs which exploded with a deafening roar, sowed terror and confusion in the ranks of the Japanese samurai, who were accustomed to ritual one-on-one duels. But the samurai, despite heavy losses, fought with fanatical courage and fury, defending their sacred land. After a full day of fierce fighting, the Mongol commanders, having suffered significant losses and fearing for the fate of their fleet, decided to retreat to the ships to regroup and continue the battle the next day. And that night, a sudden and furious typhoon struck the sea. The storm, unseen for that time of year, scattered and sank most of the invasion fleet. More than 13,000 men perished. The expedition ended in a crushing disaster. But Kublai was not one to retreat. He perceived the defeat not as a sign from above or a dire warning of fate, but as an unfortunate accident, the result of his admiral's incompetence. For 7 long years, obsessed with the idea of revenge, he prepared for a new, even more grandiose invasion. A gigantic armada was built at a frantic pace in the shipyards of Korea and southern China. In 1281, he threw forces against rebellious Japan that were unseen since the Persian invasions of Greece. 2 flotillas, one from Korea and the other from southern China, numbered in total, according to various estimates, from 4,000 to 4,400 ships and carried an invasion army of 100,000 to 140,000 warriors. This was the largest amphibious landing operation in human history, until the Allied landing in Normandy in 1944. The Japanese, however, had not been idle. For all these 7 years, they had been feverishly preparing for defense. Along the entire coast of Hakata Bay, they built a long stone wall several meters high, which was intended to prevent a cavalry landing. When Kublai's gigantic armada arrived off the coast of Kyushu, it was unable to carry out a quick landing and got bogged down in positional battles. And again, when the huge and unwieldy Yuan fleet was concentrated in narrow bays, the incredible happened. A typhoon of even more terrible apocalyptic force than the first one struck. The hurricane raged for 2 days. It broke thick masts like reeds, tore sails to shreds, and threw the huge, clumsy Chinese junks against each other and onto coastal rocks. It was not a battle. It was a monstrous slaughter orchestrated by nature itself. The losses were unimaginable. According to various estimates, from 70 to 80% of the entire expeditionary force perished. Only a tiny fraction of the fleet managed to return to the mainland. The Japanese, stunned by their miraculous salvation, named this life-saving hurricane Kamikaze, divine wind. They became definitively convinced that their country was under the protection of the gods. For Kublai, this was a crushing knockout blow to his prestige, his treasury, and his military might. The sea proved to be the one enemy the great conqueror could never subdue. Failures pursued him on his southern frontiers as well. Blinded by the thirst for expanding his empire, he undertook several ruinous campaigns into the jungles of Indochina, to Vietnam, then known as Dai Viet and Champa. But the dense, impenetrable jungles, the hot and humid climate, deadly tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery, and the brilliant guerrilla tactics of the Vietnamese under the command of the national hero Tran Hung Dao proved to be an insurmountable obstacle for the Mongol heavy cavalry. Accustomed to the open steppes, his huge armies suffered humiliating defeats, incurred colossal losses from diseases and ambushes, and were ultimately forced to retreat in disgrace, achieving only a formal and meaningless recognition of vassalage. Equally unsuccessful and humiliating was the naval expedition to the island of Java in 1293. The local ruler, Raden Wijaya, by cunning and deceit, made the Yuan army defeat his internal enemies and then treacherously attacked the weakened Mongols and shamefully expelled them from the island. These constant military failures on all fronts had severe long-term consequences for the Yuan Empire. They cost the treasury hundreds of thousands of lives and astronomical sums. All the country's resources were spent on building fleets and equipping armies, which forced the government to sharply increase taxes and uncontrollably print more and more unsecured paper money, spinning a spiral of hyperinflation. But most importantly, the myth of the invincibility of Mongol arms was shattered. The conquered and oppressed peoples, especially the millions of southern Chinese, saw that their cruel masters were not all-powerful. The murmur of discontent, caused by a heavy tax burden, humiliating ethnic discrimination, and a series of military defeats began to grow louder, undermining the foundation on which the colossus of the Yuan Dynasty stood. The last years of the great Khan's life were overshadowed by the bitterness of foreign policy defeats and a series of deep personal tragedies. In 1281, the same year the divine wind destroyed his second armada off the coast of Japan, his beloved wife and most faithful and wise advisor, Empress Chabi, died. She was not just a spouse and the mother of his heir. A woman of outstanding intelligence and tact, she had been his closest associate for decades, often softening his fits of anger, restraining his riskiest undertakings, and giving sound advice. Her death was a terrible, irreparable blow to Kublai. And 5 years later, in 1286, a new misfortune befell him. His eldest son and carefully prepared heir, Genjin, whom the Mongols called Qingkim, died from the effects of alcoholism. Genjin, who had received a brilliant classical Confucian education, was the hope of the Chinese scholar elite, who saw in him a future ideal ruler. His death not only plunged the aging Kublai into a deep depression, but also created a serious dynastic crisis, as an heir now had to be chosen from among his grandsons. Having lost his wife and son, broken by humiliating military failures, the aging and ailing emperor began to withdraw more and more from state affairs. He sought solace in the only joys available to him, abundant food and wine. He gained a great deal of weight. His body became obese and clumsy. He suffered from excruciating attacks of gout and other diseases related to intemperance. Real power in the empire increasingly fell into the hands of unprincipled and corrupt favorites and finance ministers, such as Ahmad Fanakati, killed in a conspiracy even earlier, and his successors, who viewed the empire as a source of personal enrichment, increasing levies to the limit and causing universal hatred among the population. The grandeur and brilliance of his court, which had once amazed Marco Polo, gradually faded. Kublai Khan, The great Khan of the Mongols, Emperor Shizu of the Yuan Dynasty, passed away in his capital Dadu in February of 1294 at the age of 78, having outlived almost all his contemporaries. According to Mongol custom, he was buried in a secret, unknown place in the sacred Mongol area of Burkhan Khaldun, next to his great-grandfather Genghis Khan. His death marked the end of an entire era. What then is the legacy of this titan, this colossal figure who stood at the junction of two worlds? It is as vast as it is deeply contradictory. For Mongol national history, he is the Khan who became Chinese. A traitor who moved the capital from sacred Karakoram, abandoned the nomadic way of life, trampled on the precepts of his ancestors, and through his separatism led to the final split of the unified Great Mongol Empire. His reign became the beginning of the end of Mongol world dominion. As his successors on the Yuan throne increasingly immersed themselves in Chinese culture, losing their martial spirit and connection to the steppe, which ultimately led to their expulsion from China less than a century later. For Chinese civilization, he is a dual figure. On the one hand, he is a cruel foreign conqueror who established a humiliating racial regime for the Han Chinese. On the other hand, in official Chinese historiography, he is the legitimate founder of the Yuan Dynasty, an emperor who accomplished a great deed. He put an end to a 3-century era of fragmentation and reunited the country. He created the geographical and political integrity of China that, with some changes, persists to this day for the first time in history, firmly incorporating such remote territories as Tibet and Yunnan. For world history, Kublai is, above all, a ruler whose empire, albeit briefly, became a bridge between the distant civilizations of East and West. During his reign, the Mongol peace reached its apogee, ensuring an unprecedented scale of exchange of goods, technologies, ideas, and people across the Eurasian continent. Gunpowder, the compass, printing, blast furnaces, paper money, all these Chinese inventions and technologies became widely known in Europe during this era, giving a powerful impetus to its development and, ultimately, preparing the ground for the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. It was thanks to him and his openness to the world that Europe received its first vivid and detailed description of the fabulous and distant land of Cathay from the lips of Marco Polo. Kublai was a man of astonishing paradoxes. The grandson of the greatest destroyer in history became one of the greatest creators. A nomad born in a felt tent in the middle of the steppe, built one of the most brilliant and planned capitals of the then world and managed the most complex and ancient bureaucratic machine on the planet. A ruthless conqueror who knew no mercy for those who dared to resist him, was a generous patron of sciences and arts, a ruler who proclaimed religious tolerance in his multi-confessional empire. His life is a grand epic of boundless ambitions, of the nature of power and of the terrible price that must be paid for imperial greatness. He spent his whole life desperately trying to sit on 2 thrones at once, to be both the great Khan of all Mongols and the Chinese son of heaven. Perhaps in this lay his main personal tragedy and his main historical achievement. He created an empire that was neither fully Mongol nor fully Chinese, but which for one short, dazzling historical moment became the undisputed center of the entire world. And the shadow of this giant, the shadow of Kublai Khan, still lies on the pages of world history. A reminder of a time when the will of one man could change the destinies of entire continents.